Bien, si vous le voulez bien, nous allons commencer notre session. Si vous voulez prendre vos places. Donc il s'agit de la première session. On va parler de gouvernance mondiale et de gouvernance économique et implicitement évidemment aussi financière mondiale. Vous ne vous étonnerez pas si je passe tout de suite du français à l'anglais pour vous dire que we have the chance of having an exceptional panel. I will just say a few words on global governance because it seems to me that during the recent period, say to oversimplify the 45 last years, there has been some crystallization of the concept of governance, I would say a concept of good governance in the economic field, which was something starting in the private sector, expanding to the public sector, and also at a global level. This idea that there was some kind of correct governance, good governance, which had more or less some kind of universal reach, is something which came progressively and, if I may, culminated as something which was really quasi-universal, not only at the level of each economy or each country, but also at the global level with the collapse of Soviet Union. Then it seems to me started a period of 15 years, something like that, where we were really observing some kind of large consensus on what was the appropriate governance, the correct governance. And it was a short period of time. It was a period of time where the rhetoric of the financial institutions, also of the United Nations, was expressing some views which were very much affirmed as being really appropriate, the idea of participation, orientation towards consensus, transparency, reactivity, inclusiveness, and also respectful of the law, respectful of état de droit. All that crystallized and was very visible in the rhetoric, as I said, of the international institutions, including the United Nations. And that was also a period where the United Nations itself was functioning in quite an extraordinary way because we had several successive consensus of the Security Council, of the 5 permanent members, which was really demonstrating that in this corridor of time, there was really something like a large consensus on what was appropriate in terms of governance. And then, of course, there was a change, and we are experiencing that change, and it is precisely why the panel is here to make a picture of what is the present state. And as we all know, we have now the emergence of new institutions, in some cases, that are more or less juxtaposed with the Bretton Woods institution. I'm speaking of the 2 institutions that are one in Shanghai and the other one in Beijing. And of course, we have the BRICS, enlarged BRICS, and we are in a country which is a member of the enlarged BRICS here, which is not opposing the G20, but complementing, if I may, the G20, with a grouping of countries that are the main shareholders of the financial institutions, the main shareholders of the economic and financial world on the one hand, and another group, a club, if I may, which is gathering those who are the minority shareholders of the very same institution and want to discuss. I don't consider they are opposing violently, but it seems to me that they are expressing views that are different and the will to have their say also. The responsibility of the West, more or less, as Thierry de Montbrial said a moment ago, is certainly that the main shareholders, if I may, Europe, the US, did not accompany sufficiently rapidly the importance, every year more important, of the other countries and economies, and I'm speaking, of course, of the countries in development and of the emerging world. So this is what I wanted to say, because it seems to me that we are in a very complex world. Again, Thierry was very eloquent on that, and it is extraordinarily important to understand better how the world is presently working in this very, very difficult period of time. I said we had the benefit of extraordinary panelists. If I may, I will immediately mention their names. First of all, I would like to mention Gabriel Felbermayr, director of the Austrian Institute of Economic Research. He was the leader of the famous WIFO Institute in München during 9 years, or 10 years even, and president of the equally famous Kiel Institute for the World Economy during several years also. Vincent Koen, a chief of country studies division in the OECD. He worked, and I was very happy with that, in Banque de France and in the IMF, and he is bringing about the OECD vision, which is very important. John Lipsky is presently senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins University. He is chair of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and he was acting managing director of the IMF, as well as JP Morgan's chief economist. Jean-Marie Paugam, Deputy Director General of the WTO since 2021. Your job becomes even fantastically more interesting and stimulating with the new executive branch in the United States of America. You had many responsibilities before taking this position of Deputy Director General in trade, development, and international finance. And Qiao Yide, yes. If you permit, I hope I did not make mistakes in pronouncing your name. You're Vice Chairman and Secretary General of Shanghai Development Research Foundation, and you are a renowned expert for international finance and economy, and you worked with the Ministry of Finance of your country. So, without further ado, I will give the floor immediately to yourself, my dear friend. Please.
Thank you.
I understand you might have slides.
I have some slides. Thank you very much, Jean-Claude. Thank you, Thierry, for having us here again. It's always a big pleasure and a privilege. My job is to talk a little bit about Europe in a fragmented world, and as an economist, I would like to provide you with some data. Now, I'm saying in a fragmenting world and not in a fragmented world, which I think is a first sign of hope. And mentioning Europe and fragmentation and world, we should not forget that Europe has a whole own governance problem as well, and a whole own question of fragmentation in both ideological space and also in terms of economics. But I'll take a European perspective on the world, and I think this is important. Why? Because if you look at what holds us together, besides conferences like these, this is international trade, international finance. If you look at trade and goods and services, we still see that the European Union is an important player, and at the same level, more or less, than the United States and China. And sometimes if we follow the European debate, one has the impression that Europe forgets about that. That we have a huge role. And actually, this is 2023. 2023 was not a good year for trade. And nonetheless, the EU, if you do the accounting, has a larger share of exports and of imports of goods and services than have the United States and China, just by slivers, but still. So we have a huge responsibility, and if the Brits had not left the European Union, that would even be larger. So this is the first fact that I would like us to remember. The second, if we look at the world today, we see that it has changed. This is, again, the year 2023, and the color scheme tells you what is the most important trade partner for all the countries pictured here. Blue means that the European Union is the most important partner. Green would be the United States, and the yellowish orange shade means China is the largest trade partner. And what you see is that the South American space, for example, large parts of Africa, this region, Southeast Asia, now have China as their largest trade partner. And actually, there are more countries in the world for which China is the most important trade partner than Europe. This has changed in 2023. And if we look back in time, the picture would be different. So this is 1995, and you see the world was blue then. That is not only a fact of numbers, of data, it's also something that affects psychology. The idea of European decline. I'm a European and a proud European, and I think as Europeans we do the world no favor in being so much convinced of our own diminishing role. That does not help solve the global problems. We are a mini world on our own in Europe with many of the problems in governments that we see at the global level as well. And we have offered solutions in our past, and we might do so in the future again. But as you see, the dynamics are as they were, from moving from being the global trade hegemon to someone, to Europe being now second, if you count the number of countries, to China, that has left an impact on the state of thinking in the European Union. The EU has engaged with many countries around the world, and there too Europe is a leader, is because there's no other bloc or no other political entity that has so many trade agreements. We have something like 42 or so trade agreements notified to the World Trade Organization with something like 74 countries. And this is, of course, when we talk about governance, important, because all those trade agreements have legal texts, have political compromises between all these partners. What you also see is these dark blue arrows that show to the point to geographies with which the European Union is right now trying to write new trade agreements or to get them passed. Mercosur has been on the agenda in the last years, and my own country, Austria, as well as yours, Jean-Claude, are quite skeptical. Unfortunately, I must say, because we have no other means than law, international law, to improve governments, to reduce uncertainties and to make progress. Europe is also speaking to many other countries in the world, from Australia to Indonesia to India, and has been doing so for a while. But the process is stuck. It's not easy to find new agreements, and that is not so much a problem of the world itself. It's something that starts within Europe as well. So when you say the world is fragmenting, it is fragmenting. Europe is fragmented as well. There's a big discussion of trade or international economic relations being weaponized, to become instruments of big power rivalries. And in that sense, the question of trust is crucial. And when we ask this question in Europe, we might turn to the balance of payments data and ask, where are our economic partners, and what are the sizes and quantities involved with that? And what we see when we do that is that the European economy is still a transatlantic one, and by wide margins. This is a matter of fact. Sometimes the discussions in our European unions are misleading. If you take the United States and the United Kingdom together, those two trade partners, international economic partners, dominate the picture quite dramatically. Let me come back to that. But it is not just a good trade, it is also trade in services. Then there's a lot of financial interactions as well between the transatlantic partners. When we talk about services, that is where we still see the world converging, where we still see the world globalizing. Might not be true anymore in goods trade, but it is still true in the space of services. I'm coming to my last slide, which says that when global value chains are interrupted, economic damage is made, and that damage can be quite substantial. This is taken from a recent study in which I was involved, and I'm only showing here the European countries, but we did the whole exercise for the whole world. And the dark blue bars show what countries would lose in terms of their economic welfare if they were disconnected from global value chains. And global value chains is not the entire trade, it's trade in inputs and raw materials, it's not trade in final goods. What you see is that all these European countries would suffer dramatically. You also see a lot of heterogeneity. And again, Europe serves as an example here for the whole world. We're not affected the same when the global regime crashes. The dark blue bars for places like Luxembourg or Ireland can go up to -70. So disconnecting those countries from global value chains would be devastating. Now, when I say disconnecting, I mean that also European global value chains would be destroyed, which is, I hope, very unrealistic. I believe in the single market. And the pink bars show you what happens if global value chains are interrupted, but the European single market stays intact. And the big lesson for the world, I would say, that Europe offers here is that those pink bars are by such large margins smaller than the dark blues. So the single market, our free trade at the continental level, protects us from what's happening around the world. I think this is important for Africa, it's important for the Gulf regions, it's important for Southeast Asia, that regional integration is probably the most important protection against what's going on at the larger world scale. I'll stop here, but of course there is so much more to be said, and I'm looking forward to the whole conference and to our conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. You have to know that there is a limited time of 6 minutes for the introductory remarks, but then we will engage in discussion and we will respond to questions from the audience. Vincent, you have the floor. Six minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you very much to Mr. de Montbrial and Ifri for inviting me back again at this wonderful event. I'm very honored to be part of this panel chaired by central bank and civil service legend President Trichet. This is really a treat for me. I'll try to give you a tour of the world economic outlook as we see it at the OECD in 5.5 minutes that are left for me. Let me start on a positive note. Global growth has held up fairly well over the past 3 years following the bounce back from COVID. And despite the enormous adverse supply shock imparted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Of course, this global average masks sharp contrasts across countries. Compare, for example, the buoyant US performance to the stagnation endured by Germany, or compare India's dynamism to China's struggle to approach the 5% mark. Turning to inflation, central banks have tightened policy substantially in 2022, and the supply shock of that time has largely faded, so inflation is back to more comfortable levels, although service price inflation remains sticky in many countries. Remarkably, unlike in earlier tightening episodes, labor markets have remained quite buoyant, performing quite well overall. The euro area unemployment rate at 6.3% is at a historical low as we speak, and the US unemployment rate at 4.2 is still relatively low as well. So in that sense, central banks have achieved something like immaculate disinflation. However, even if inflation has come down, even if unemployment is not high in most countries, there is a feel-bad sense among consumers. Consumer confidence has languished both in emerging markets and in developing economies. To a large extent, this is the result of the price jump that occurred post-COVID and post-Ukraine invasion, with consumers feeling that the most visible prices, the everyday prices that you see at the pump and in the supermarket, have risen so much more than income in most countries. And besides, the lingering sticker shock experienced at the supermarket leads to the perception that prices are still rising fast because the price level is so much higher than before, even if inflation has actually come down significantly. While consumer confidence has languished, business sentiment has held up somewhat better, especially in services, and this tends to convey a more accurate sense of what economic momentum is at the moment. And against this backdrop, for the G20 countries, the OECD has the following fairly reassuring forecast that growth would continue at the global level to cruise around the 3% mark. This is true also for the OECD average, like for the G20. But again, performance is highly variable across countries, as you can see on this chart. Our inflation forecasts are also reasonably reassuring, even though inflation remains very high in some emerging market countries and uncomfortably low in China, where it rather flirts with deflation. Now, let me turn to the risks following this seemingly benign baseline forecast. One risk relates to energy prices. They could very well spike again, notably if geopolitics take a turn for the worse. Second, uncertainty surrounding trade policy has soared over the past few weeks. Many outfits have cranked out trade war scenarios with various assumptions about how sweeping and how high tariffs may be, how fast they might come into place, for how long, for whom, and with various assumptions about how exchange rates would react in this context, and about trade diversion, notably from China to Europe. But at the OECD, we have refrained from speculating about what we cannot yet calibrate in our models. Of course, we do worry that a more fragmented, protectionist trading environment and inward-looking policies would hurt supply chains, raise prices, and reduce competitive pressures that deliver productivity gains. This is, of course, very much in line with the theme of this year's WPC, and I trust Jean-Marie will have a lot more to say about this. Another risk pertains to public finances, which in most countries are in poor shape. One factor that supported growth in many economies during and after COVID is fiscal support in various guises, but some of that support turns out to be hard to unwind. If you think, for example, about Japan and Korea, where they repeatedly extend energy subsidies, contradicting their commitments on climate change, and even though energy prices have come down. Public debt ratios have reached new highs in advanced countries and in EMEs and in low-income countries. And at the same time, spending pressures associated with aging populations, climate action, and defense priorities. We see this week the Europe-NATO countries discussing how to bring defense spending up from 2 to 3% this year. All these pressures are building up on the fiscal side. And at the same time, interest rates are unlikely to go back to a near zero era as we have experienced before COVID. The BIS actually also echoed this concern just 2 days ago in their quarterly report. Turning to policies, we see central banks continuing to ratchet interest rates down somewhat. The ECB cut by 25 basis points again yesterday, the Swiss National Bank by 50, the Bank of Canada by 50. The Fed may also cut next week. The only outlier here is Japan, which continues to normalize monetary policy. And lastly, as to governments, not only are the debt ratios far above any comfort zone, but in flow terms, looking at the deficit numbers, far greater efforts are called for to restore fiscal space and fiscal sustainability. Our main messages are quite nicely captured by the Bloomberg, Financial Times, and Wall Street Journal headlines that you can see on the last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vincent. I noted in the Gabriel exposition how we are vulnerable to deglobalization or friendshoring, as we say, or reshoring, particularly the European, and your figures were very striking. The idea that, Vincent, that the danger of trade disruption could be considered considerable is also something that is at the horizon of all what we say. I was also very interested in the figure on the debt, because when I look at debt, outstanding public and private debt today in the global economy, and I compare that with the same outstanding global debt as a proportion of GDP immediately before Lehman Brothers, I see that if this indicator is one of the important indicators, we are more vulnerable at the moment I'm speaking than we were immediately before the explosion of the great financial crisis. So we have to be very cautious in this respect, it seems to me. John, I think it's your turn. You have your 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. And first, I'd like to thank Thierry de Montréal for the invitation to join this wonderful conference again. And I'm very honored to be on this great panel chaired by Jean-Claude, one of my, dare I say it, heroes. And my remarks are going to echo in a certain way Jean-Claude's introductory remarks. I want to go back to the foundations of global governance in the post-World War II era. For economic and financial issues, of course, the critical institutions were the IMF and its associate, the World Bank, and the GATT, now the World Trade Organization. The character of these organizations that they were multilateral and treaty-based, and therefore their decisions carried the force of international law. They had radical goals and were designed to create a rules-based, open, and non-discriminatory system, headed, in the case of the Bretton Woods system, the Bretton Woods institutions, by institutions that were designed to be able to act, including in circumstances in which there was not consensus on issues. There were voting rules in which, for most operational issues, majority rules. The insight of the post-World War II institutions was that global trade was going to be the dynamic element leading global growth in the post-war era, and that this growth in trade would produce both economic and financial integration. And in fact, it was hugely successful. From 1950 to 2007, growth in global trade virtually every year led growth in global output. And that period also probably represented the most rapid period of economic growth globally in ever. We are currently at the fourth systemic inflection point of the 21st century in terms of our global system of global governance. And the previous three inflection points have tended to undermine the pre-existing system. The key question, therefore, is will this fourth inflection point that we are facing, and I will describe in a minute, do the same, or will it rather strengthen the system? First inflection point was the global financial crisis. It brought into creation the G20 leaders process that claimed for itself the role of the leading forum for discussion of economic and financial issues. This G20 is not multilateral, is not treaty-based, is voluntary, and has no voting rule. And as a result, as we'll see, has operational problems It's not designed to act. In that sense, it was a weakening of the pre-existing system. And one of its initial goals at the first G20 Leaders Summit in November 2008 was a pledge to avoid new protectionist measures and to ensure the adoption of the Doha development round of the WTO. The truth is, since the global financial crisis, virtually every year, global trade has grown more slowly than global GDP, the opposite of the entire period previously, and global growth has been substantially slower in this period than previously. In addition, it's clear that in the wake of the crisis, the Chinese authorities adopted new views about financial integration and instead, among other things, became an enormous leading lender to emerging market and developing countries outside of the pre-existing Paris Club system. Again, a development that undermined the pre-existing system. Second inflection point was the pandemic that has created powerfully contradictory forces. On the one hand, it created a tremendous focus on security, on resilience, and as a result, on national focus on national issues, national security, supply chain, etc. At the same time, it was clear that the crisis itself only emphasized the role of global forces and the challenge of providing global public goods, and they are of health, climate, environment, demographics, and migration, etc. In other words, we have these very contradictory systemic forces. But in the context, as we heard from the Vice President of the Côte d'Ivoire, the one effect has been to seriously challenge the economic and social situation in many developing countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Third inflection point, Ukraine, which of course has demonstrated that in the context of great power conflict or great power disagreement, the G20 has become virtually inoperable in terms of being able to produce action. Lack of a voting rule means that every one of the members has effectively a veto over any action. Ukraine, of course, the Ukraine invasion by Russia has created a very difficult challenge for the European Union's economy, and in general has created a much more complicated set of global supply chains that is less efficient, more fragile, and more costly. So that's what has brought us to today. And I guess one easy way to define the current inflection point is that it'd be too simple, but I'll just say the challenge of the second Trump administration. The challenge is, does America first mean America alone? Does it mean that we are going to further complicate and obstruct free trade or global trading relations? Obviously, we are seeing similarly contradictory forces. As Gabriel showed us, the EU is in the process of trying to negotiate new international trade agreements. But is this going to succeed, or are we going to move to a world of greater trade conflict? At the same time, as we all know and as speakers have already mentioned, we are also at an inflection point or seeming inflection point in terms of the potential contribution of new technologies to productivity growth and hence economic growth. In other words, there's also reason for optimism on global growth, but as we know and have heard, that it's not challenge-free in terms of global governance. And of course, I speak of the easy term is artificial intelligence. But in general, it seems, at least, for example, in the United States, there has been an acceleration of total factor productivity associated with adoption of new technology and new working arrangements. The IMF is, as we know, is pessimistic about global growth prospects for the next 5 years, assuming that the debilitating systemic forces that I've already talked about will continue. But there's opportunities at the same time that could contradict that pessimism. We'll have to see, but hopefully a year from now, when the World Policy Conference convenes, we'll have more clarity, hopefully on the positive side, but certainly not for certain. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
No.
I note that the IMF is more pessimistic in the medium, long run from now on than it was in the past 10, 15 years. I have in mind that they imagine that growth in the US could be only 2.1% in the medium term, and in Europe only 1.3% in the medium term, which more or less corresponds to the idea they have today on what would be the growth potential on the two continents. But the silver lining is that it's very likely that total factor productivity will prove to augment and be somewhat sustainable in the medium run. At least it is the sentiment in the US when we discussed. Less in the rest of the world, I have to say. The rest of the world is more or less on the solo observation. I see a lot of investment, but I don't see the productivity progress until now. But in the US, you see some productivity progress. So I hope very much that it is the US which is right, and that we will see the expansion of this productivity thanks to the fantastic surge in technology that we have. I turn to Jean-Marie. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. À mon tour, bonjour à tous. Je veux remercier nos hôtes et bien sûr Thierry de Montréal, Madame Koen pour leur invitation. Moi, je voudrais vous proposer une sorte de bilan d'ouverture de la globalisation à la veille de cette nouvelle année avec les échéances, avec trois remarques. La première, c'est que la globalisation continue. Ça a été dit par les précédents intervenants. On a tous débat sur la déglobalisation depuis plusieurs années. Aujourd'hui, ce qu'on voit, c'est que le commerce continue à progresser. Commerce des biens, avec des discussions, des reconfigurations. Je les passe. Il y a une table ronde qui va venir, qui va en discuter largement. Ce qu'a dit John est important, la reconfiguration des chaînes de valeur, le raccourcissement. Mais enfin, ça continue à progresser et le commerce a une incroyable résilience. C'est un peu comme l'eau. Le commerce passe par là où il faut passer. Quand on le bloque ici, ça. Le commerce des services démontre ça de manière encore plus éclatante parce qu'il progresse très rapidement. Donc, on n'est pas dans une déglobalisation. Deuxièmement, il y a des lézardes, de la fragmentation, et dans trois domaines qui sont encore sous contrôle, mais qui sont chauds, qui sont significatifs. Le premier, c'est les politiques environnementales et climatiques, parce qu'elles ne sont pas coordonnées, et il y a une espèce de gap de gouvernance entre, par exemple, l'accord de Paris et l'OMC, pour que les conséquences commerciales des politiques climatiques soient optimisées, coordonnées de la meilleure manière. Alors, c'est évident pour quelque chose comme la tarification du carbone, par exemple, où on voit des Européens qui mettent un prix sur le carbone et des Américains qui mettent des subventions sur les alternatives au carbone. Donc évidemment, quand on est une entreprise, qu'on a le choix d'être taxé d'un côté, taxé étant une facilité de langage, ou subventionné de l'autre, on regarde ses choix d'investissement. Mais c'est vrai des restrictions aux exportations, c'est vrai des standards, la question des standards verts est très importante. Donc il y a tout un domaine où on peut avoir fragmentation autour de ces politiques qui par ailleurs sont évidemment totalement légitimes et je crois que les discours d'ouverture nous en ont rappelé les enjeux. Deuxième zone de fragmentation, tout ce qui est politique de sécurité économique, qui là aussi embrasse un champ très large, puisque ça va de la sécurité des approvisionnements, et la crise du Covid, effectivement, a été un grand déclencheur, approvisionnement énergétique, approvisionnement en matières essentielles, et notamment alimentaires, jusqu'aux politiques d'autonomie industrielle, qui, elles, peuvent induire là aussi des interventions publiques qui peuvent conduire à fragmenter un peu le commerce. Et là, on voit un deuxième point chaud. Troisième zone de tension, évidemment, les politiques de sécurité tout court. Elles ont été évoquées. Je ne veux pas commercer avec toi parce que tu n'es pas mon ami ou parce que nous nous faisons la guerre. Il y a des sanctions, il y a des embargos, il y a des... qui commencent à prendre une place de plus en plus importante dans le commerce international, même si là encore, nous ne sommes pas dans une hémorragie. Et évidemment, ces trois zones de tension sont liées entre elles. Parfois, elles se superposent. Le sujet des véhicules électriques, par exemple, est un des plus intéressants parce que vous avez l'enjeu climatique, vous avez l'enjeu industriel et commercial, et parfois l'enjeu de sécurité. Quand un pays comme les États-Unis dit je me méfie, je ne veux pas importer des véhicules électriques qui ont des logiciels embarqués qui pourraient menacer ma sécurité nationale, on voit bien comment les trois choses s'imbriquent. C'est pour ça, personnellement, j'utilise assez peu le terme de protectionnisme parce que je crois qu'on est assez loin des protectionnismes classiques qui visent à gagner un avantage comparatif, même si cette préoccupation classique existe toujours, souvent, mais ce n'est pas la seule. Donc on a ces trois zones de tension, un système de gouvernance autour de l'OMC qui, évidemment, est bousculé par tout ça. Et l'OMC, il faut la penser pour avoir une vision à peu près claire de l'état des lieux, comme un stock, un flux et un mécanisme de règlement des différends. Le stock, c'est l'acquis. C'est les principes de transparence, non-discrimination, bonne foi qui ont fondé la croissance mondiale depuis le GATT. Globalement, ces principes ne sont pas, d'abord, ils ne sont pas contestés par personne, mais ils sont à peu près respectés. Il y a des brèches, il y a des coups de canif, et parfois plus que des coups de canif quand il y a une guerre commerciale, mais nous n'avons pas de fuite massive ou de refus massif de ces principes qui continuent de régir juridiquement 75% des échanges mondiaux, et tous les accords de libre-échange sont également construits sur le même socle, et puis en pratique, l'essentiel des échanges courants. Le flux, qui est la négociation de nouvelles règles, est beaucoup plus compliqué, parce que là-dessus, il y a des questions de désaccord qu'on trouve dans toutes les organisations internationales, sur le bilan hérité, sur savoir si les règles antérieures sont équilibrées ou n'ont pas été équilibrées. Donc il y a cette demande de rééquilibrage de règles avant d'en négocier de nouvelles, qui a tendance à compliquer la capacité de l'OMC à bouger. Et d'ailleurs, c'est une petite nuance avec ce que disait John, nous, à l'OMC, nous sommes, bien sûr, juridiquement, nous avons la règle de la majorité possible dans nos textes, mais elle n'a jamais été utilisée en pratique, donc nous sommes toujours régis par le consensus, ce qui rend un peu plus lent le mouvement, par exemple, sur les sujets que j'évoquais, comme les politiques climatiques. Troisièmement, le règlement des différends, comme vous le savez, il avait une tête qui était l'organe d'appel de l'OMC, qui avait pas mal juridictionnalisé les relations commerciales. Cette-ci a été débranchée, d'une certaine manière, pour le moment, par l'opposition des États-Unis, qui considèrent que ça attente à leur souveraineté. Donc il y a une négociation pour redémarrer quelque chose là-dessus. Ça ne veut pas dire qu'entre-temps, toutes les disputes commerciales échappent au droit. Le système antérieur, qui est sans organe d'appel, en fait, qui est celui qu'on appelle des panels, continue à fonctionner. Nous avons aujourd'hui encore, quotidiennement, des demandes de règlement juridique des disputes. Donc on est sur un verre à moitié plein dans ce domaine-là. Voilà. Et donc c'est avec ça qu'on aborde évidemment les échéances qui ont été évoquées, et notamment l'entrée en fonction de la future administration américaine.
Merci beaucoup, c'était très, très intéressant. Vous êtes prudent sur la nouvelle administration américaine, me semble-t-il. Peut-être aurez-vous des questions là-dessus. Bien, on va passer à vous, Qiao. Évidemment, vos propos vont être écoutés avec une extrême attention, puisque vous êtes le citoyen d'un pays qui est l'un des deux plus importants du monde sur le plan non seulement de l'économie actuelle, mais de la perspective. You have the floor, sir.
First of all, thank the organizer having me today. I'm very happy to come back to attend the panel. Today, I'm mainly talking about the challenge facing by current global economic governance and its future. The current global economic governance represented by the Bretton Woods institutions, which is IMF, World Bank, and the WTO. I guess they play very positive role in keeping the world peacefully and steady economic growth in the past 80 years since the end of the Second War, as John described very detailed about economic growth. But now I guess it's critical time for global economic governance, because it seems the idea of might is right has started to prevail in many places, which lead the global economic governance in the danger of falling into jungle law situation. Specifically, I guess the three challenges the governance have severe damage on the global economic governance. First of all, as many speakers mentioned, current war between Russia and Ukraine, war in Gaza. Second challenge is isolationism and protectionism in some countries, particularly in the United States. The third challenge, I guess, Bretton Woods institution, as I say, on the one hand, play very positive role. On the other hand, may not good enough to meet the needs of global South. So therefore, its future pretty much depends on these three challenges, whether can be resolved smoothly. First of all, the question is whether the two wars I mentioned can be peacefully resolved, or at least not lead spill over to the rest of the world. That's the first question. Second question is the isolation and the protection, whether can be reversed in not too long time of the period. If not, I guess something similar with those in 30s of the last century would happen again. As well known, after the end of the Second War, the President Wilson in the United States proposed the US should join the League of Union, but unfortunately, his proposal has been denied by Congress. I guess maybe that at least is one of the reasons finally towards the Second World War. The last question is whether the advanced country can adapt themselves to let the existing Bretton Woods institutions to fully meet the needs of global South and let them have more rights in decision making. If they do, the global governance would really become a good public good to keep the world peacefully and healthy growth. If they don't, the global governance would totally dismantle or even to be disaster. In summary, if these questions I mentioned or the challenging can be resolved smoothly, the positive global economic governance still would be back on normal track. That's my hope. If not, the global governance would fall into maybe several small groups by themselves governance, which may not necessarily the worst scenario. Another worst scenario, the global governance will totally collapse, which not impossible. I just stop here.
Thank you very much indeed. Bien, we have some time for dialogue, question, response. Qiao, you concluded in not excluding the fact that we could have a total collapse of global governance, if I understand well. I guess that it was more or less in the working assumption that we could not engineer appropriate peace, and that all the tensions that we are observing at the level of geostrategy would not be solved. Am I right to make that working assumption?
Sure.
That it is geostrategy that would engineer this collapse of global governance that you are mentioning?
Yeah, I hope the international community can recognize these dangers. Then they can make a great effort to solve the challenge. Otherwise, I do worry about the future.
Let me check on the colleagues another assumption, say. We say that the geostrategic enormous difficulty that we have presently would be appeased progressively, and that it would not be the dominant influence on the global economy and global finance, and that we could engineer a better representation in the Bretton Woods institution of those emerging economies and developing economies that are more or less pushed down by the traditional European, Japan, and the US. Say that we have a better functioning, a better representation in the Bretton Woods institution. Do you trust that that is pretty possible, taking into account all the resistance that we see, and that then we would be, of course, in a better world where the idea of having a counter system, constellation of institutions would appear not to be reasonable? John, I see that you have a body language. What would you respond to this question?
Yes. First of all, as I suspect that in this audience everyone is aware, constitutionally, in other words, within the Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund, there is a requirement that at least every 5 years there is a reassessment of the voting shares in the institution. And as I suspect everyone here knows, the articles say that the voting shares should be based on economic weight. Unfortunately, the concept is not defined, so it's left to negotiation. But it's obviously very clear that a big change was negotiated at the Seoul G20 summit in November 2010 that would make a substantial change in increasing the share of dynamic, emerging, developing economies in their voting share. That was a partial change. It was very hard to engineer because, of course, it's a zero-sum issue. If some gain, some lose. And the big loser is obvious, among other things, the European countries that have been overrepresented. There has been, at that time, in Seoul, 2010, there was a commitment to not only adopt the changes then, but to undertake a relatively rapid reassessment of voting shares, in which it was understood there would be further increase, among other things, in the share of China and others. That second round, which was supposed to have happened within a couple years, 2010, still has not happened. And so it's important that the atmosphere of cooperation on all sides needs to be improved so that can move forward. And if I could just say, an area where there is a problem and an emerging problem. An existing problem has been the breakdown in the pre-existing Paris Club mechanism for renegotiating debt of basically developing economies. And since the huge increase in the lending by new lenders in new forms since the global financial crisis, that system of renegotiation has not been working at all well. And it's important that there be improve cooperation to make you could use the phrase the G20's common framework for debt treatments to become effectively operational. This is important because, as we've heard already this morning, that the latest developments, latest round of post-Ukraine strains has increased the debt pressure on many developing economies, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So progress is needed. The third, of course, has been the reemergence of global imbalances in trade. Not only has trade grown more slowly, but imbalances are reappearing. It's quite possible that China is going to have a current surplus of in excess of $1 trillion this year. The export performance of China has been very dynamic in the last year. That in the past has given rise to frictions. So it's clear that there's need to be a greater sense of cooperation to address these issues on all sides.
Thank you very much, John. Thinking of global imbalances, Gabriel has something to say, but I have a question for him. When you presented exports and imports, we could have had the current account, and then we could have compared the current account of the US and the current account of Europe, and then you would have something like -3 or more % of the GDP on one side of the Atlantic and plus on the other side of the Atlantic. How would you qualify this permanent situation of surplus on the one hand and deficit in the US?
So, thank you. But this is something we have observed for a long time now, and it's somehow it's not standing in the way of growth and of collaboration, because we have seen the same signs, more or less the same quantities for a long time.
Is it sustainable in the long run?
Yes. So that's the big question. It was sustainable for a very long time.
Yeah.
And I think it is not sustainable in the sense that what it means for Europe is that we have a large excess of savings over investments, and that is certainly not sustainable, no, from a European point of view. And while for the United States, this has been since the 70s, more or less, no, and it looks like it's connected to the role of the dollar, which might see challenges in the very long run. No? So the fact that I don't know whether it is completely true, but the fact that Russian oil exports to India, at least partially, are now invoiced in renminbi. No? So these changes might make it difficult to maintain the large deficit position of the United States in the very long run. But I wanted to say something about John's observation on zero sum. Right? It's of course, if you change the voting shares at the IMF, or if you change the rules, there is this notion that there's always a loser and a winner, and that is of course very true. But it does depend on what is our baseline. Now, if the baseline is the status quo, making changes leads to losers and winners. But if the baseline is the multilateral system or the global governance system being destroyed or becoming dysfunctional, then it is again a positive sum exercise to work together to make the system work and continue to work. No? So I think this is an important question of perspective. Now, what are we comparing with? And another remark that I wanted to make is we often talk about big power competition now. No? And I'm an economist, and I was brought up with the idea that competition, sometimes at least, no, it can be positive. It can be something that gives rise to new ideas, and maybe that is a little bit of a positive side of it. No, that for example, in climate change, Europeans have opted for taxes or carbon prices. The United States is going a different way. Now that is making our lives difficult. No? It creates questions of competitiveness and so on. But it is also a way of understanding how different approaches work. And if we see the American approach is better, then we might come back and say, let's correct our European stance. And vice versa. No? If it becomes incredibly expensive for the United States, they might want to learn from us. So this idea of competition that makes life difficult, but it is possibly also a source of inspiration, of innovation, of new ideas.
Thank you very much indeed. I share your view. Please, Qiao.
Yeah, I'm going to just add something regarding the voting power at the IMF. I agree with both John and you mentioned that. Actually, since 1910, nothing changing on the evaluation of quarter. I guess last time is 16 general evaluation. But what I try to say, not China, even India, less representative. Both of them make a compromise because last time, just every member of IMF increased their funding by 50%, but the structure, no change. That's something actually China and India and the global South made a compromise, just want to keep the IMF have enough funding. That's something I guess in the future, both sides, advanced country and the developing country should do more in cooperation. These kind of things cannot always forever existing. Otherwise, the legitimacy of IMF will be reduced. That's my point.
Thank you for this remark, which is very important. I see that you have the...
Yes, I'd like to say something as a former IMF staffer to complement the discussion on quotas and voting powers in the executive board. What is very striking, if I compare the IMF today to what it was 30 years ago when I worked there, is the number of Chinese experts working in the IMF staff and Indian experts. We now have the second Indian chief economist at the IMF, Mrs. Gopinath. We had Raghu Rajan already 20 years ago. So I think from the inside of the institution, both China and India are having much more influence than in the past, even if in terms of voting powers in the board, things are moving more and more slowly. And then I would add that for the OECD, which used to be known as the Club of Rich Countries, as you will recall, the OECD was created under the name OEEC after the Second World War to administer the Marshall Plan and then reinvented itself with a new name. And it had only 18, indeed mostly rich member countries at the time, but since then, we've expanded, and we are now 38 member countries, many of which are emerging markets. And we engage very actively with the BRICS, except for Russia these days. And we have 8 important EMEs as accession countries, including Brazil and Argentina and Thailand and Indonesia. So we are seeking to give more of a voice to the other countries that matter increasingly on the world scene. And here's the win-win. There's nobody's losing, on the contrary.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. Jean-Marie, do you have anything to say on this particular point?
We work on consensus as a WTO, so it's already balanced.
If I may, picking up what has been said on the currencies, clearly, the dollar has no particular statutes. We exploded the Bretton Woods system, and so it is the free choice of the, I would say, economic agents, investors and savers and traders to pick up the dollar as a currency which is utilized 3 times more than the euro, if I may, which is second, and much more than the renminbi, even if there are some kind of, I would say, growing trade denominated in renminbi. But it is clear that this is due mainly, it seems to me, to the fact that the United States is a full-fledged political federation. There is one treasury, not a dozen like in Europe. And if I take the euro as a currency and the dollar as a currency, I don't see enormous difference between their capacity to keep their value, to be stable, to inspire confidence. At certain moment, the euro inspired more confidence than the US dollar. So the problem is that the signature, which is on the bills or the bonds, is single in one case, and you have the German Bund, you have the OAT, you have the Italian Treasury, and the, I would say, depth and liquidity of this benchmark market is in the proportion of 1 to 10 or 1 to 15. And that makes, of course, a great part of the difference. And the renminbi is not yet convertible. The day the renminbi becomes convertible, yes, you change the structure exactly like if the European were a political federation. But we will see what happens. In the century, a lot of things can happen, probably. I see that we still have something like 10 minutes. I was wondering whether any one of us has something important to say now, or we could ask a question coming from the audience, if there are. Yes, there are questions. Very good. Please.
Thank you. I'm Trichet from Israel. I would like to ask you, what do you think will be the influence of the fact that Trump wants to put taxes over imports from different countries in the world?
Who wants to respond to that? Yeah. No?
I didn't hear.
Jean-Marie, do you have
I didn't hear the question.
I didn't hear the question.
you didn't get the question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh. So, could you repeat slowly?
The impact of...
I'm Meir Shitri from Israel, and I'm asking what will be the implications of the fact that President Trump going to put taxes over import from all the different countries.
Tariff.
Tariff's the question.
Yeah, it's clear. What about the tariffs? Do you have... Are you bold enough to say what you really think?
Well, what I really think is that we don't know. It's a would-be policy for the moment, and there are three questions which are going to be debated within the US administration. The first one is obviously the policy mix, because tariffs are by nature inflationary and recessive, but at the same time there is going to be a very expansionist fiscal policy and maybe deregulation. So how is that going to combine, and what are going to be the choices of this administration in terms of the inflationary price that they are ready to have paid? And as you know, inflation tends to, I think a central banker knows more than me about that, generate interest increase and appreciation of the exchange rate. So it cancels your trade policy if you have your exchange. So this question of the policy mix is not clear. Not to say that it's not really reasonable, I'm not being judgmental, but to tax something that you don't produce. I was discussing recently with a major coffee trader in Geneva, and he's not concerned because the United States is not growing coffee. So why would they tax it? That would be purely inflationistic. So the first uncertainty is going to be about this choice of policy mix. The second one is about this discussion on, are tariffs going to be tactical, like to be transactional, or are they going to be strategic with a view to decoupling? This nobody knows at this stage. And the third question is obviously what is going to be the reaction of the others. And there are four possible reactions. One is to do nothing, one is to negotiate, one is to retaliate, and one is to circumvent. And it is likely that major powers will have the four options. Smaller powers may have maybe less. But the combination of mobilization of this option is going to define the size of the shock. So this is a long way to say that I concur with Vincent about the uncertainty, which is the characteristic of what we're going to face.
Thank you very much. At least one thing is pretty likely, namely that all this will be transactional. That it seems to me that it is the way the new executive branch of the US sees things. But Gabriel,
Yes,
you have a...
Actually, as you say, it is transactional. We have tried in several studies now to quantify the welfare effects of 60% extra tariffs on China, on 10% extra tariff on everyone, and there is no proper economic model that would show that this is a very good idea for the United States. No? So I think there's consensus on this, but that implies, as you say, that this is a threat. Unfortunately, it's a credible threat, and so it will probably bring countries to the negotiation table, because that is what you need if you want to achieve changes in the system where efficiency gains are already very much exhausted. So it is about zero-sum bargaining, no? Where those threats are of very big importance. And what we also know is what, at the end of it, what could remain is a strongly appreciated dollar. No? This is also what the models tend to say. And with a more appreciated dollar, we have less world trade. No? So I think this is probably the safest prediction that one can make on the dollar and on the size of global transactions.
I think you expressed the view of most economists. But we are all economists, so maybe we have different views. What would you say yourself?
Well, I think that the direction of the change implied by tariffs is clear, but we really have no clue about the magnitude. Your successor, Christine Lagarde, said, let's negotiate. Let's buy more LNG from the US. Let's offer something and try to avoid 10 or 20% extra tariffs on the EU countries, or 60% on China. And we know from the first Trump administration that there is a part of bluster up front and a lot of noise, and I think we should not be paralyzed by this and try to keep our heads cool and see what's coming. The new Secretary of the Treasury, well, Scott Bessent, who has been named, has a very good understanding of financial markets. Hopefully, he and others in the new administration will serve to contain any ideas that are a bit extremist on the trade side.
American citizen John Lipsky, what would you say?
Here's a level of uncertainty. It's widely considered that the former the special trade representative in Trump's first administration, Mr. Lighthizer, was going to be the great guru of trade policy in the second administration. In between, he's issued a book called No Trade is Free. What's remarkable about it is all the benefits claimed by Mr. Lighthizer in his book for protectionist policies actually are contradicted by experience. So his recommendations seem to contradict the actual use of tariffs and what their effects would be. And it's notable that Mr. Lighthizer is not a member of this administration, and not only in addition to what we just heard, the Secretary of the Treasury is a financial markets fellow who must understand some amount of these things. The National Economic Counselor, Kevin Hassett, is a serious economist. He's certainly conservative, but certainly well-trained and very experienced. So it adds a huge depth of uncertainty about exactly what's going to happen, and probably argues in favor of what you say, Jean-Claude. This, at best, let's hope this is transactional and actually could produce some positive results rather than the other way around.
Thank you very much, John. Can I ask Qiao, do you have any comment?
Yeah, I agree what the previous speaker said. The general direction had been clear because Trump definitely will do something for raise the tariff for import. But unclear is how much he used that as a tool to achieve other goal. How much really he want to impose. Also, as you mentioned, we don't know how much other country to react or totally take a retaliation or just negotiation. We don't know that. So only thing we can do, we go ahead one step by step to take some response to whatever he want to do.
Thank you very much indeed. I see that time has elapsed, and if we have a last question which should be extremely concise, and we would respond in equally concise manner, that would be good, but there is no question. So I will conclude in saying that we had a very good interaction in this panel. Bravo.